Hey guys, this is Matt from Amateur Filmies and welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, we'll be doing another collection overview and we'll be showcasing our releases from the company Shameless Screen Entertainment. I've also heard them go by Shameless Films, but I always just call them Shameless for short. Sarah and I own about 10 releases from Shameless, so we'll be going through them one by one, giving you our thoughts on them, and yeah, we hope you enjoy. So Shameless is another film distribution company based out of the UK, and I guess you could say they specialize in like cult horror films. They release a lot of like Italian horror films, which is mostly what I collect from them, but they also have some cannibal films and just sort of other general exploitation cult horror stuff. Their catalog isn't quite as large as some of the other boutique companies we collect, like Arrow Video and Scream Factory and that, but they do have some interesting titles that I definitely wanted to pick up when I first saw them, because a couple of them at the time I didn't know where else to get them, and the label itself intrigued me, so I sort of looked at them as a way to get access to some movies that I might not have been able to otherwise. So we'll just get right into it. The first film I'll be showing is directed by Umberto Lenzi, and I actually have to cover this one up. This is Almost Human. Sorry, I know I'm not showing much there. So in the past, I've talked about how much I like Umberto Lenzi's films. He's had some hits and misses, but for the most part, I quite enjoy his work. Apart from this one, which I also really like, he's also done Nightmare City, which I think is a really great zombie film that I think more people should watch. He also did Cannibal God, which despite, the more problematic parts of it, I think is actually quite a decent cannibal movie. And also he did Man from Deep River, which kickstarted the cannibal boom in the 70s as well. And he also did Spasmo, which is a really funny giallo. I don't know if it's intentionally funny, probably not, but it's like a interesting giallo film that he did in the 70s as well. So this movie was an Italian production, which you can probably guess by the fact that it was directed by Umberto Lenzi. But essentially this is part of a subcategory of films or a genre called, I'm going to butcher this name, I've never figured out how to say it properly. I believe it's poliziotteschi, which is not how it's spelt, the genre is spelt, but when I put it into Google Translate, that's what it says, so that's what I'm saying now. Please correct me if I'm wrong, which I probably am. But basically that genre describes a subcategory of like Italian crime films that came out, I think, in the 60s, but became really popular in the 70s, which is when this film came out too. The plot is quite simple in that it's about a trio of criminals who kidnap a rich person's daughter and they demand some type of ransom, and the film alters between their perspective and the perspective of the police who's leading the investigation. The leader of the gang plays his role really well, and he's very, very violent and mean-spirited, which I think fits the film quite well because it is a violent film, which isn't a surprise again because it is directed by Umberto Lenzi after all. I recognise one of the actors in this film. It's actually Ray Lovelock, who I first saw in The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue, which I thought was a really good film as well. And I also saw him recently in Live Like a Cop, Die Like a Man, which I also quite liked. And interestingly, this film is actually scored by Ennio Morricone, who I'm sure you guys know from his work on other big films like the ones by Quentin Tarantino. I think he did The Hateful Eight. But yeah, it was really cool to see that he'd scored the music on this as well. Even though I haven't seen too many Italian police crime films like this one, I would say of the ones I have seen, it does rank quite highly. I really, really enjoyed it. I thought it was quite an effective thriller. I found the characters to be quite memorable and the action sequences to be choreographed quite well when they happened. I would say though, I couldn't necessarily recommend this to everyone. It is quite a grimy, nasty film, but if you do like movies like Last House on the Left or like Night Train Murders and stuff like that, you probably will find things to enjoy in this one, but I do think that this one overall is quite a really good film. The next film I'll be showing is Torso, and this film was directed by Sergio Martino and came out in 1973. To my knowledge, this is a film that is held in quite high regard by people who enjoy giallo films and have seen this one, and there are quite a lot of positive things to say about this movie. For one, I think one of the most positive things about this movie was the camera work, in particular the way that they use the camera to shield the killer's identity. Some of the ways they cover up the killer's identity is by just completely covering their face, filming them as they leave the frame, or sort of filming through the line of sight of the characters who can only partially see the killer. Certain camera angles I thought were really creative and added a lot of tension to the film, as did the creative use of shadow as well. In classic giallo style, the reveal at the end that explains the killer's motives did feel a little bit shoehorned in, but that just comes with the territory of watching giallos anyway. Sometimes those type of reveals work and sometimes they don't. I would say that this one's pretty middle of the road. Definitely could have been better, but at that point you don't really care anyway. I think the journey to that point was actually quite enjoyable. One thing I did want to point out about this film though is that the dialogue in this film is very sexually charged, which I know is a weird thing to say, but it also, again, is very common with Italian giallo films. The reason I'm bringing this up in the first place is because there were just so many conversations that were of a sexual sexual nature that it was really distracting. And while I'm not like a prude or anything like that, I just feel like it was really a big missed opportunity to write more compelling dialogue that may be more interested in the characters and sort of flesh them out a little bit. There were a lot of conversations and dialogue in this film that just felt completely inconsequential and just cringy. So overall, I would say it's a slightly above average Giallo film, which could have been improved with better written dialogue and a more plausible motive for the killer. This next film I'll be showing will actually be making a cheeky appearance in our next Blu-ray haul, but I figured I'd show it now because it does pertain to this collection. That is Mountain of the Cannibal God. Again, I have to cover this up. As you can probably guess from the title, this is another film from the 70s cannibal genre, and I was really glad to add this to our collection because this is one of those popular cannibal films that I actually had never gotten around to seeing, so this was actually a first time watch for me. This film was released in 1978 and was actually also directed by Sergio Martino. I would say overall this is a decent cannibal film. It definitely pushes the boundaries as far as the imagery in the film. If you're at all familiar with the cannibal genre, you'll know that it does have a lot of distasteful things on screen, such as animal cruelty, which I absolutely loathe, but unfortunately is part of the history of these films. But again, this film does sort of push the boundaries in those regards, so it did sort of lose me a little bit on that. But there are some other good things about the movie. There were some particularly effective sequences in the movie, most notably in the last act of the film. Without going into spoiler territory, I would say that there were some really cool ideas explored at the end that made the film worth watching in the first place. Up until that point, most of the movie wasn't that engaging really, but by the end point, it really ramped up the intensity. The acting was pretty good. I would say that Stacy Keach was certainly the standout. But as far as the characterization goes, I would say that in this particular subgenre of film, I don't know what it is, but there's always at least one character that is a completely garbage human being and just an all-round POS. This film is no exception. I distinctly remember seeing it in Cannibal Holocaust, Cannibal Ferox, and even Eli Roth's Green Inferno. There is just one character in this film that you absolutely hate from start to end, and they just have no redeeming qualities. I don't know if it's like something that needs to be in the genre, but it is definitely a common trend. It's not necessarily a flaw, but it's just an observation I made after watching so many of these cannibal movies. And as far as whether or not I would recommend this one, I would say that I'd probably only recommend this one to people who are already into the cannibal genre. I think this is one that if you are into that genre, you might be interested in this movie and maybe you want to cross it off your list. But in general, I think that you could probably skip this one if you're not sort of already invested in that type of movie, if that makes sense. Here we have the film The New York Ripper, directed by Lucio Fulci and released in 1982. I remember I first watched this film fresh out of high school on like an old DVD that I found at a used store, and at first I thought it was so silly, although my opinion on it has changed since then. Basically, if you did know, this is a generic hunt for a serial killer type of giallo film, but it distinguishes itself in one peculiar way, which is that the killer, who continually taunts the police and calls up the victims, speaks like a duck.
What do you want?
While this is very silly and amusing to listen to, I will say that the film has grown on me after watching it a couple of times now. This film came out towards the end of Lucio Fulci's spree of good films, and while he obviously made more films after this one, most of the classics that he's remembered for came out around this time period, which was 1982, and before that. This film, while extremely silly at some points, is actually a decent giallo film at the end of the day. It is one that I would probably mostly recommend for people, similar to what I said about Mountain of the Cannibal God, I would mostly recommend this to people who are already into the giallo genre, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to someone who is first getting into that genre. If I wanted to go with a Lucio Fulci giallo film for that type of person, I would say maybe try Don't Torture a Duckling first, because I think that one's probably the superior giallo film overall. Next up, we have the film All the Colors of the Dark, also directed by Sergio Martino. I will mention now as well that while I have seen every film that I will be talking about in this video, some of these ones I haven't watched in quite a long time, and this is one of those films. When I was first getting into the giallo genre and reading up about it and stuff like that, I would always see the name of this movie pop up, so I did take it upon myself to hunt it down and finally watch it. I will say that I wasn't a big fan of the writing in this film, but it does have a really distinct visual style that I think worked really, really well for the movie and made it really memorable in particular. While this isn't my favourite giallo film, I do remember hyping myself up for it before I watched it, so that may have affected my viewing experience as I had probably some type of expectation going in. But as I said at the start, it also has been some time since I've watched it, so I probably should watch it again soon. This next film is Four Flies on Grey Velvet, directed by Dario Argento. Again, this is another film that I've been wanting to watch for quite some time now. I'd become really familiar with the other films by Dario Argento in what's called the Animal Trilogy, which basically is 3 films that comprise of The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, Cat o' Nine Tails, and Four Flies on Grey Velvet. So I'd been wanting to watch all 3 of these, and now I finally have after buying this one. In my opinion, you can definitely see Dario Argento's signature on this film. You can definitely see his classic style in this movie. It also has the really good common traits of a giallo film in it, like you got the winding mystery, some really really zany characters, some unconventional killer motives and ways to find the killer. Overall, I think this is quite an effective Giallo film. If you haven't seen any of Dario Argento's films, I would say this one is probably middle of the road to higher quality, I would say, compared to some of his other works. I would say if you're new to his works, definitely go with Suspiria or Deep Red as a first entry, but this is definitely a worthwhile watch, as are the other films in the Animal trilogy for sure. This next one is the first of a couple of films I'm about to show that is directed by Michele Soavi. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, but this one is The Church. I have to cover this up yet again. I hope I'm getting my facts right, but I'm pretty sure that Dario Argento and Michele Soavi actually have had a working relationship since like the 70s or 80s, where Michele Soavi, he would actually work as a crew member of sorts or like a minor character in some of Argento's films, and eventually progressed from that point to actually writing and making his own films, which I actually thought was really, really cool. Although I am hoping I'm remembering that correctly, of course. I actually remember hearing about this film years ago, actually, on like old YouTube videos and like message boards and stuff like that. So it did catch my attention. I remember specifically the plot itself sounded really, really cool. I'll just quickly read out the plot on IMDb and tell me this doesn't sound badass. An old Gothic cathedral, built over a mass grave, develops strange powers which trap a number of people inside, with ghosts from a 12th century massacre seeking to resurrect an ancient demon from the bowels of the earth. That to me sounds like an absolutely mad, sick plot, and I was so excited to finally watch it. But unfortunately, I was a little bit let down by this one in the end. Similar to what I said with All the Colors of the Dark, I think I may have hyped myself up just a little bit too much heading into this, but like reading that plot, you can't really blame me for wanting something really wild and crazy. Although there are scenes in this that are actually quite wild as well. I just don't think it really lived up to what I was expecting it to be. That said, again, same with the other films, I haven't seen this for quite some time, so I will rewatch it quite soon. I was hoping to rewatch it for this video actually, but I didn't find the time. But yeah, I did quite like it, but I think it could have been a little bit better, I think. Next up, we have the film The Sect, also directed by Michele Soavi. Again, as with The Church, Dario Argento actually also has a writing credit on this film as well. And this one, I think I enjoyed a little bit more than The Church personally. I definitely was expecting to like The Church more going into both of these films, because while this one did sound interesting, that one just sounded sick. But I can say that this one is quite decent overall. I meant to say this when I was talking about The Church as well, but I think the biggest strength that The Sect has is its use of imagery and the set pieces that Michele Soavi took advantage of. It made for a lot of really memorable sequences and added to the horror overall, I would say. I noticed a lot in this video that I have been talking about set pieces and imagery quite frequently, and I don't mean to keep harping on about those particular qualities in these movies. It's just that because a lot of these films are Italian productions, sometimes the writing can feel a bit stilted, just because sometimes it can be very culturally specific or very exposition heavy. And while I don't mind that in these movies, I know that for a lot of people who are watching these films for the first time, they might not like it necessarily. For me, it's come to be part of the charm of watching Italian films in general, so I don't mind it, but I did want to mention that I do recognize that I have been talking about the imagery a lot, which is basically because it is a universal characteristic of these horror films, whereas the dialogue can be a lot more culturally specific. While there are a few things I could nitpick about this film, overall I did enjoy it, and I thought it was a unique sort of original idea that Michele Soavi directed quite competently. I do want to rewatch this one again, as with a few of the others, as it has been some time, but overall I would say this is worth checking out if you do like sort of movies about cults or sort of satanic rituals and that sort of thing, if that makes sense. The second last movie I'll be showing today is The Strange Vice of Mrs. Wardh. I know this film has its fans, but I would argue that out of the films that I've shown here today, this one to me is probably the most forgettable personally. While this isn't necessarily a terrible film or anything like that, I feel like if you're starting to watch more Giallo films and you haven't seen this one, I feel like there are just much more interesting, more imaginative Giallo films out there that if you hadn't seen them, I would prioritize watching those ones over this one. This one feels a little bit lackluster for me, and as I said, I know a lot of people like this one, but there were just certain elements that just didn't really sit well with me, I think. I definitely don't regret getting the film. It was another Sergio Martino film that I hadn't seen. I definitely did want to watch it knowing that his name was attached to it. Plus, as I said before, it is a pretty well-known Giallo film, at least by my estimation. So I don't regret watching it in that sense. It's definitely not one that I'll be rewatching too often. As I said, I just think there are just so many other better Giallos out there that are more compelling or have more interesting things going on in them. I just found that my interest in the film was waning the more that I watched it, and just in general, I found it really hard to connect to the plight of the main character, I would say. I feel like I am being very harsh on the film. Maybe I would benefit from another watch, but I did see this film not too long ago, so I don't know how much my opinion would change, but I'm not going to necessarily write off the film based on that first viewing, so I will watch it again. Maybe I'll like it a bit more that next time. And the final film I'll be showing in today's collection overview is arguably probably my favorite film out of the ones that I've shown so far, and this is Della Morte Dell'Amore, or The Cemetery Man. So again, this is another film by Mikel Suavi that came out in 1994, and it's basically a really quirky zombie movie, and it stars Rupert Everett, who, funnily enough, you might even know from mainstream movies like My Best Friend's Wedding, or I think he even had a voice role in Shrek 2. He's been in a bunch of stuff, so it was really interesting to see him in a movie like this. In my opinion, I think this is Mikel Suavi's crowning achievement. I think this film is leagues ahead of both The Church and The Sect. I know he's done other films like Stage Fright, but I haven't seen that one yet. But by my estimation, I think that this film is the one that he's going to be most known for. It is really, really well done. Both the performances are absolutely excellent. The practical effects are great, and some of the things that he's come up with, as far as like the different zombie sequences that happen in the film, I don't want to be too specific because I sort of want you to watch it for yourself. But there's some really, really memorable shots and like. Again, set pieces. The cemetery is great. But yeah, just the zombies themselves and like the nature of the characters. I could just go on and on and on. I really, really like this movie, and I think it was a very ambitious movie based on his previous films that I was talked about earlier. This one felt like a really big undertaking, and I think he tackled it really, really well. One thing that I didn't expect to get from this movie was the fact that it actually allows for multiple interpretations. I was sort of expecting more of a clear-cut film based on, as I said, watching his other films, The Church and The Sect, which are sort of more straightforward. I wasn't expecting to be able to sort of reflect on this and come up with my own theories about the movie, and had a lot of fun reading other people's interpretations of the movie as well. If you are at all a zombie fan, you definitely really should check this film out if you haven't seen it already. It just has so much good stuff going for it that I feel like if you're a fan of zombie movies, you will definitely find something to enjoy in this one for sure. So that brings us to the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching. Sarah and I both really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll have another video up soon. If you've seen any of these films, definitely let us know what you think about them. We'll always love hearing your thoughts, as we always say. And if you have any recommendations for other films that we should check out based on the films we've shown here, also let us know. Thank you very much for watching again, and we'll see you next time.